And we're live. Cool. Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to RaC Guild. What are we? We're number 5 now. It's a cozy team today, but we've got a great presentation from our guest today, Martin, from Canada. I'll let Martin crack into it and explain exactly what he's doing. So this is September's RaC Guild Townhall meeting. We're growing the community slowly. Please do get involved. Look at the other videos that we have from our previous meetings. There's some great information in it. And subscribe, get involved, come along to these meetings in the future. Today, Martin Perron. We're going to have him first and then a little bit of a discussion afterwards, talking about Canadian legislation and blocks versus ChatGPT. Yay. AI and rules as code, a big subject. Please, Martin, take it away.
Yeah, well, I should mention, I say versus, but in reality, my conclusion is it's a combination. It's a dual effort. It's a team effort. So you'll see that as we get to it. So yeah, okay. Should I just introduce myself and then I can hop over the slides? I can present it as if it's a video that will be observed later. I can also, as I present on my laptop, I'm going to switch screens and stuff. Feel free to ask questions as they come up. Interrupt me as you want to, okay? So all good to go. All right, so hi, my name is Marty. I'm a lawyer and a developer at the Canada School of Public Service in Canada. So Canada School of Public Service is a academic-like institution within the federal public service in Canada. And in my team, which is specifically a kind of public sector experimentation innovation team, I play around with rules as code. I say I play around because it's very much experimental at this stage. I've been using all sorts of random tools, trying to play around with encodings. And my mission these days really is trying to find ways to make the process of writing laws into code as user-friendly for the experts that would understand those rules best. So I'm thinking drafters, subject matter experts, lawyers, or you might just be a hyper-specialized individual in a particular niche area of interest, and you want to have some kind of say or input in the way that those rules are developed. So that's really the target of what I try to experiment with. So I started working on my current team 3 years ago. When I joined, I was paired with Jason Morris, who was on interchange with the Government of Canada at the time. And Jason is well-known in the rules as code space. I was not necessarily a programmer, although I'd done some basic programming in law school, just some general learning out of interest to be a little more efficient with my work and try to be smarter with how I get stuff done. And I was looking at the rules as code tools that existed. We looked at OpenFisca, which we had experimented with in the past with a lot of success. There was other tools out there that were worth looking at. Like I can name a few, but I'll just stop at those ones for now. We got to blocks largely because I wanted to find something that I could learn pretty fast and start to use to express ideas with subject matter experts and do it in a way that gave me the most flexibility with my thinking as a legally trained individual, while also getting me right into action and being able to kind of test stuff live with people and move forward with it. So blocks existed prior to that at a certain stage, and Jason and I kind of worked together and co-developed a new version at the time, which we've been using a lot at the school, and I'm going to show you in a second. The real goal is to use predicate declarative logic code with a friendly interface so that we can give, as I've mentioned before, the experts the best flexibility in expressing their ideas in a simple, easy-to-use manner for a computer. So with that said, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Let's do this one right here. You're going to do the window. You're going to have a bit of a duplication for a second here. All right. So I can't see you anymore. If you have any questions or anything comes up, comments, just interrupt me as we go. So first thing I'm going to show you here is a case study. This is one that we recently published, and it's about using tools to write laws in the code in the drafting kind of space, in the drafting environment. In this case, it was done at the policy stage with policy experts trying to extract knowledge that subject matter experts in the fields of pensions had and putting them into code. I just wanted to bring this to your attention because it was recently published. Does a very good summary of what I'm about to talk about today and go into some more details. There's a very good file here, a PDF that's also worth exploring. So just pointing that out before I forget to do so. With that said, I'm going to close that tab and we will get started. So today I'm going to show you how to encode a small piece of legislation. It's a definition from a federal act in Canada called the Canadian Navigable Waters Act. We're going to write the definition of a navigable water into code. So I start off by going to my law right here. And you will notice down in my law under section 2, definitions, we have a definition for navigable water. So I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to move down here to find a for greater certainty clause that helps further define the definition, narrows the definition. Once I have this information, I go to my blocks interface. This is the one I've been using. And in the rule editor, I can paste my the language of the act itself, do a bit of formatting. And within the code editor, it will divide itself by section, paragraph as necessary for the encoding process. So this version is a little different than the one I know you've been shown, I think 2 months ago when Jason did his presentation. It's a slightly older version I've been playing with and using in my projects. And in this version, if I go to a root clause, for example, this is the chapeau of the definition of navigable water, you will see I've written into code, into a Blockly-like format of code, my understanding of the meaning of this paragraph. Now, I've been doing this collaboratively with a drafter at Justice as an informal exercise, so it's nothing here is actually, vetted and approved in any kind of formal manner, but as a collaborative exercise with a drafter, we've gone through, we wrote some of the rules into code and then kind of tested them out, did some statutory interpretation kind of stuff with it, and we came out with this. A couple things to note. This format here, the Google Blockly setup, it's a drag and drop interface. It makes it easy to use versus going and typing in something like this. So I would guess that if I went to a drafter and said, let's start typing this together, they won't exactly be excited. But if I were to present this, it seems a lot more approachable, user-friendly, easier to read, easier to use. That's really the goal here with blocks. So this is one part of that encoding. It's the chapeau. Within the root definition, I also have paragraph A, which I've coded like as such, and it's fairly easy to read, as you can see. When we know water is in a category, body of water, and it's publicly accessible by land or by water, we know that according to part 2A of the definition, that body of water meets the paragraph criteria. So easy to read. I'm going to bring your attention to 2.01 here, which is one of the interesting ones that we got to encode here. So 2.01, it's written as a for greater certainty clause right here, but when you read it, it comes off a little more as an exception. So for greater certainty clauses are usually reaffirming components that already exist within your rule. But when I read this, it seems like we're introducing something, the idea that artificial irrigation channels and drainage ditches do not fit within the section 2 definition. So we wrote as an exception. However, as we looked into how to properly interpret this in practice, we discovered that there is some case law that would lead us to have a modern statutory interpretation that would require an inclusion of bodies of water that were similar in size or functionality, even if they happen to fall under these categories. So we went ahead and made a couple changes. These changes aren't things you can read when you read the actual sentence. It's something that's kind of hidden underneath. It was a good example for us of instances where the language, even though grammatically it might say one thing, it might actually in the legal practice be a little bit different. It's good to note these kinds of stuff as we go. Sometimes it makes total sense. Sometimes it might not make sense. I'm not sure in this case. This is just what we kind of practically, we just discovered in this case. So yeah, go ahead, write your rules in the code. I've showed you that. Let's go to the testing phase. Once you've encoded your rules, you can build some tests. You can make high-level hypothetical tests where you ask your law, like, give me every possible way in which a body of water meets the definition of navigable water. That's a type of test. You can also do very specific ones. You can say the Ottawa River, for example, is a body of water. It meets X, Y, Z. Is it navigable water? When you do these tests, you have a set of explanations and answers that come out of them. So in the scenario editor here, I'm doing a giant hypothetical test. I say everything's uncertain. I don't know anything, but I know that everything must be considered and involved in the criteria. Let's run this, see what happens. You'll notice that as I run it, you're going to get a couple of answers. I think there's 12 of them. So 12 different answers. And if I open them up and break them down, you have fairly detailed explanations. I'm actually going to pop out of this test and show you another one that has a better kind of piece of source material we can consider. So here I did a specific test with a particular body of water that exists in Ottawa. Sorry, not Ottawa, in Canada. So I spoke about Chestermere Lake. Chestermere Lake is a body of water in Western Canada that is also an artificial irrigation channel, but in its practice and its functionality, it's very similar to navigable water. And according to case law, this body of water should be considered navigable water. The way we encoded this rule should indicate that it is navigable water. And in fact, if I run this test, you'll get your answer, you'll get the breakdown, and it'll explain to you precisely why and how it meets that definition. So I'm going to take a couple seconds here and open up all these little windows. And you'll see the answer is very, very long. It's designed for a specific type of user, a subject matter expert or someone who's very familiar with the contents, that we want them to be able to go through, read the language, confirm that the logical connections are correct, and if not, highlight them, point them out to someone like myself who can go in the code and make the required changes. So as you can see, the answer is long. It keeps going. This is where the whole ChatGPT versus rules as code stuff comes in. And I say versus, but let's switch it. Let's talk about how they're different, but how they can be integrated together. So here, very long answer, detailed explanations, clear structure and breakdown of the logic of the law, but not user-friendly, I would generally say. If I'm just some person who wants to know if my body of water is navigable water, this is not enticing to read. But you can take something like this, and with some simple prompting, like I did right here, you can feed the explanation to, say, even ChatGPT 4.0 Mini here, which is the lesser sophisticated version, and ask it to summarize it for you in plain language. Now, when you do a LLM summary of encoded legislation, you need to be aware that by summarizing, you are, by default, by fact, simplifying it. And simplification can remove vital pieces of information. So you got to be wary when you summarize things with an LLM. But generally speaking, this is a pretty good summary. It tells me the name of the body of water, tells me how it meets the definition route, it tells me how it's publicly accessible, and it also explains how even though it is an artificial irrigation channel, it's similar in size and functionality to bodies of water that are navigable, so therefore it falls within the definition of the Act. So nice, simple breakdown. Now here's the ChatGPT versus rules as code part. You might ask, Marty, why did you take all this time to go into a law and write it into code and then just go back to ChatGPT to ask questions? There's a reason for that. Tools like ChatGPT or LLMs generally, they're very good at predicting. They're predictive tools. You give them a big piece of data and they can do some large level analysis and predict things. But predicting is not the same thing as reasoning. Reasoning is a different type of approach of a logical breakdown where you can directly connect ideas together, often through mapping and other type of tools, that can be trusted, that can be that can perform as expected by the person who encoded it and built it. So to show you that really quickly, I'm going to give you an example of what ChatGPT had to say when I asked them the very same questions without an encoded version of the rules to use and follow. Over here, I saved a chat through GPT 4.0 Mini. So this is the lesser sophisticated model by ChatGPT. And I start off by saying, is the Ottawa River navigable water according to the Act? Cite me the laws, give me some explanations, blah, blah, blah. Now, initially, it looks like it got the answer correct. It says that, yes, the Ottawa River is considered navigable water and meets the expectations of the rules, blah, blah, blah. However, you go through and you look at the key sections of the Act that are cited, you will see that the citations are incorrect. Section 2 of the Act does not define navigable water as what you see here in highlight on my screen. The definition is quite different. We saw it earlier, but just to quickly give you the chance to go through it again, this is the definition. And you can, when you watch this video later, you can pause and rewind and I know I'm speaking fast, so you can adjust and go through everything again and again as needed. But note that that is not the proper definition. We go back here. Section 5 is cited. Section 5 has nothing to do with the definition of navigable water. It's about work permits for building on navigable water. Nothing to do with the definition. If I keep going down here and I ask it, for example, to assume that there's a body of water called X and that it's an artificial irrigation channel, would that body of water X still be navigable water? Here, yet again, it improperly cites Section 2 of the Act and the definition of navigable water. It also goes on and provides inaccurate information and an inaccurate answer. Just generally speaking, I'll let you read through it. There's more to come, but generally speaking, it doesn't properly take Section 2.01. It doesn't even consider it. So I go further and I say, what about Section 2.01? Have you considered that? Can you consult that and let me know what the answer would be now? Again, takes 2.01 and it makes up the definition. That's not the actual definition, so it's incorrect. Goes on to do some incorrect reasoning, gives me a bad answer. Overall, I give it an F. This is not a good try with ChatGPT. It did get some stuff right, I'll give it that, but generally speaking, just because you got the right answer doesn't mean you got there the right way. You might say, okay, well, this is GPT-4o mini. This isn't the high quality one. What about GPT-4o, which is a much better version? Well, I've done the same exercise with GPT-4o. I will show you that as well. I give it the same prompt. Is the Ottawa River considered navigable water according to the Act? I go through here, you get the answer correctly, that yes, it's navigable water. But you will see in the definitions the way, sorry, not the definitions, in the explanations, the way it is explained is incorrect. Yes, it cites Section 2, that is good. Yes, it cites Section 2.01, that's also good. But if you read here, it says navigable water is defined as any body of water that is used or capable of being used by the public for navigation, whether by vessel, regardless of its size. There's the right wording there. There's correct definition, correct wordage from the definition, but the way it emphasizes certain terms, such as it has to be used by the public for navigation, and how it underemphasizes other terms, like whether it be by a vessel, regardless of its size, is incorrect. It should actually be the inverse in this case. So whether it's used by the public for navigation is one of 3 possible ways in which it can meet the definition criteria. And whether it's by vessel is actually a required component that's in the chapeau. So it's a necessary piece of this conclusion. If I go a little further down here, and I keep asking it for some information about Section 2.01, it tells me here, the Act provides exceptions for certain waters, including artificial structures like irrigation channels, ditches, or canals. Canals, if I go back to my code here, or let's go right to the Act itself. Canals is explicitly included in the definition. It's not part of 2.01. 2.01 speaks specifically of artificial irrigation channels or drainage ditches. So I got 2 of the 3 correct, but then it made up the 3rd part. So again, inaccurate information. Still, the wording's better. It's reusing more of the content. It's getting better in that kind of sense, but it's not knowing how to emphasize certain words and still throwing the wrong things in there at some moments. If I keep prompting it with more information, for example, how does Section 2.01 apply to the definition? It explains it to me fairly well here, actually, and it does a good job at listing some components. But again, the framing of the words, the emphasis of certain words over others is incorrect. I go further, and I ask it to talk about Section 28G, or was it paragraph 28.1G.1. I kind of want to lead it towards figuring it out on its own. So I just say, is there anything else in the Act that I should consider when I'm trying to figure out this definition? Still, nothing comes out. Talks about Section 3, talks about Section 4. These are actually not related. And in fact, they're citing them incorrectly. What's being provided here is not what is written in the Act itself. Keep going. Finally, they talk about Section 29 and Section 28, I think a little further down here. Section 28, this is one of the ones I wanted it to consider. It does bring it up, but it doesn't talk about 28.1G1, which is the specific clause I had written in my code back over here. So again, it doesn't know where to find that content. And then it also starts confusing or conflating the governor and council with the minister. So where the minister is cited in the act, it starts talking about the governor and council because I asked questions about the governor and council and it assumed it was the same thing, which they're not. So I've given a couple examples here, and I don't want to make LLMs look like they're complete junk because they're absolutely not. They're awesome. They're really cool. And it's amazing that I can do this kind of stuff at this level of speed. But what I'm really trying to highlight here, or what I'm really trying to emphasize, and I can actually switch off from my screen here and stop sharing and get back to talking. What I'm really trying to emphasize here is that large language models are great. There's lots of fun stuff you can do with them, and you can do some good predictive work. But when it comes to knowing exactly what rules mean, you need to be very, very careful because sentences aren't always easy to read. They can be read in multiple grammatically correct ways. Even when they are read in a certain grammatically correct way, the legalese might impose another interpretation on top of it that is not always evident for people. And it depends on the nature of the complexity of the rules that you're reading. But if we start pulling LLMs to do things like taking a rules as code explanation and simplifying it, or taking a bit of code and making a chat-like interface with it so it prompts you for information as you throw it into the editor, as it asks you questions, stuff like that. That can make things easier to use. And then finally, one that I think Jason Morris has talked about a bit that he's been playing around with is, can you auto-generate your first draft of rules? That could help things scale way faster. And you might be able to just auto-generate the code, but what's really important is having that interface in between that allows humans to intervene and validate that the code is correct. So that would be kind of a big win if we can achieve something like that. So I'm going to stop there. I've been rambling for a long period of time, partially because I knew that a lot of people might be watching and replaying this later, and so they can kind of take it at the speed that they need. But let's open it up, and if there's any questions or anything you'd like me to clarify, please do let me know. Thank you.
That was awesome, Martin. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure everybody's got lots of questions. Somebody like to kick off? Otherwise, I've got a list in front of me.
Oh, I've just got a quick comment rather than a question. First of all, I agree with Joe. That was amazing. Really interesting to see the analysis of how ChatGPT tries to interpret the legislation. I guess one thing that I noticed is that you were in the position of knowing the Act, obviously, and knowing what the definition was and whether it was correct or not. But of course, if someone from the public comes in and did the same thing, they're just going to believe it or potentially they might believe it. So it just does emphasize the fact that, at the moment, we certainly can't be using large language models to check legislation in an accurate way. That was my only comment, really.
So I would even say, even I don't know for sure what the Act means. The reality is the people who wrote it are the best people to know exactly how it's supposed to be interpreted, and the people who manage it over time as well. So really, in my mind, it's like, if we're trying, even for me, I'm trying to interpret it sort of as an outsider, even though I'm not technically as an outsider. If we can find a way to give those experts the fastest, easiest, best way to put their knowledge into the encoded format, that gives all of us a lot clearer instruction. It can also be reused internally when you're trying to amend and change rules, right? So absolutely agree. The understanding what the rule specifically means is a massive challenge to begin with. And it's also a large reason why we need to be careful with these LLM interpretations, as useful as they can be with our research and in many other contexts of our work.
Awesome. Anybody else? I'm going to dive in anyway. So you said that you started this project with a drafter sitting next to you, right? That understood this legislation. The use case of blocks right now, as a product potentially, is it more about for you getting the rules into code, right? So I mean, ultimately, hopefully, we will get to a point where all the rules are encoded, so our LLMs are actually looking at something that is accurate and potentially giving an answer to that. I mean, that's a long way away, right? But right now for blocks is the use case to do that process, to get as much of our law into code as possible, or is it for drafters creating new policy and regulation and legislation?
So blocks is in in its current alpha prototype state, or blocks is how we could see it develop. I could answer both if it's easier.
Both would be great.
Sure. So I'll first say I collaborated with a drafter who's part of a AI and rules as code working group at the Department of Justice here in Canada. The project, this is very much an experimental kind of project, so I just need to clarify, none of this is official interpretations, right? And even in her case, she's not particularly an expert in the nature of this context, but she is a legislative drafter, and there's expertise in statutory interpretation that she has that I do not have. And similarly, there's other people out there that have expertise in the nature of the content itself. So getting these kinds of people together in a room, chatting in a common language where they can get into this level of minutia, that's really the goal of blocks, I would say, in the big picture. So how do we have a language in which people can interconnect their knowledge, translate it or explain it to each other through some kind of medium, really? And so that's kind of how I approach at least tools like blocks, and doing it in a way where it can get very sophisticated and granular so that these encodings only get better over time, where we can try to preemptively answer the kinds of questions that might come up to us, but also have a capacity to deal with subjectivity and not be overly prescriptive. Blocks in its current state right now is still, as I said, an alpha prototype. So I've been using it mainly for drafting exercises and for evaluation style exercises. And there's a lot of value in doing that. You learn things. I'm sure many of you have already experienced this multiple times. When you write something into code, you uncover a lot of questions. What specifically does 30 days to the date of mean, for example? Or how do I interpret this comma and this and or in the sentence? So in this kind of sense, it's a great tool for drafting and thinking about how you want to write a rule. The byproduct of that exercise is also useful. You can save it and use it for future amendments, as I've expressed as well. But scalability is something that we haven't tested blocks with yet. So that's, I would say, a major limitation with it as it is right now. It's still very much like a kind of grassroots small project. But who knows? Who knows where things like this can go? I'm curious.
Cool. So was it hard to get that group of people in the room I'm assuming that none of these people have ever seen anything like they've never used Scratch or a tool that's similar, right? So they're not familiar with sitting in front of something like this. That's an assumption I'm making. Would that be correct?
Yeah, it was challenging at first because we didn't know what we're doing. We're kind of figuring it out as we go. And I've had instances where we did this with people together in person. I've had instances where we did this remotely, just people in different rooms, chatting in a more asynchronous manner. There's value to both. I think mixing both is kind of the optimal. But even Jason, I've never met Jason Morris in person ever, but I worked with him frequently, and we've co-developed at least this first version of blocks together. So this is I think that tools like this have a power to help people who are in different kind of environments collaborate and speak, but there's a user friendliness that still needs to be developed. There's bugs in the software. It's still not easy to teach people how to do it, even though I've had the chance to teach some people to use it. There's structural limitations. There's a whole kind of onboarding process that's a bit, involved with it. So I'd say that once there's a bit of familiarity with what we're trying to do, what's going on, and as you start to figure out the role a little better of how do you kind of manage a rules as code project with a tool like this one, it really starts to shine. It really starts to show you oh, wow, these subject matter experts did not even think about this little part that the drafters were thinking about, or the drafters thought this, but the programmers were very clear that that was not instructive enough. That kind of conversation, it flourishes. And it has pretty much always led to very important questions for everyone to consider. I see there's comments and raised hands. I haven't been paying attention. I'm sorry. I'll let you lead though. Tell me whoever wants to go next, feel free.
Con, I think you were up next, mate. You're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry, Marty, that was a great presentation. Really, really interesting and very, very topical. Just so I understand, and excuse my ignorance, I'm not that technical, but as far as I could see from what you presented, there's sort of four components. There's the original written legislation. There's the Blockly Google Blockly or Scratch sort of version where you drag and drop. Then there's that outputs a controlled English version, if you like. I'll call it controlled English version, where you can read, but it's broken down, it's well structured. And then in the background, you've got, I believe, SCASP, right? Now, which is the programming language that drives blocks. You fed the controlled English portion into the LLM, and that's what you used to test whether the LLM would interpret it correctly, and it did, because you gave it I call it the controlled English version. I'm not sure what term you would give it, which meant that theoretically, using LLMs, all you really need is that controlled English version. You actually don't need, am I right in saying you don't actually need the SCAS part for delivering a user interface to the citizen or to the end user? The controlled English version is the bit that you can feed, in this case, the use case being, I want to chat with a chatbot or an LLM to give me an accurate result or to my question about a certain piece of legislation. You don't need to worry about the underlying programming language that generated the controlled English version. Does that make sense? That you only need the controlled English version for the LLM to be trained on?
I think I understand your question. I might miss a portion of it. I should also clarify, like, my background, training technically, I am a lawyer by training. So what I speak of on the computational side, you always have to take with a grain of salt. I tend to refer to like Jason Morris or other colleagues on my team on the hyper technical stuff. But what I will say is that when I get an explanation that's generated out of blocks, so I think that's what you talk about, the control part. Okay, so if I have one explanation that comes out of blocks, all I have to do is copy that explanation into a LLM with a basic prompt, and it will summarize the explanation. But sometimes you get multiple explanations. So I can show you really quickly here, for example. If I were to go over here, my navigable water test, I did a very general open-ended question, and I ran this, and it gave me 12 explanations. Each of those explanations are different, and there's specific reasoning that is being outlined in each case. So what I would do in this case is, for each one of these answers, I would have a large language model summarize it in plain language, probably in a very short way, and then in a slightly more detailed way, and then provide the user this detailed breakdown. So there'd be three options for them to consume the rule. But when it comes to the interface side, like the navigating the questions, so here, for example, the way you typically throw in information is through this add fact button. So you throw something in and you type a name in. You can use LLMs, from my understanding, to make it more conversational, more chatbot-like. But if you're to ask me technically how to do that, I'm not totally certain. I refer to my Gen AI colleagues on this one for the most part, and we're just still kind of experimenting with it, playing around with ways of getting it to work. So I can't explain more on that, and at least on the technical side, it's the limitations of what I'm able to really understand.
Yeah, and I need to.
Does that answer your question?
Sort of. I need to understand blocks a little bit better too, in terms of when you say, yeah, the explanations, and what have you. So no, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that too. Am I muted? No. I think that that it was more that the LLM was doing the summary, not that it was interpreting or able to interact based purely on the summary or on what had been inputted from the controlled English. I've now forgotten what I did have a question. I forgot what it was now. I'll come back to me later.
No problem.
I'm fascinated to hear what Alfred's question is, because he pulled up his whiteboard.
Looks already,
and
yeah.
we'll see the top of his head.
Firstly, can you guys hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. I'm really sorry for being late. I'm not going to make any excuses, just late. So I really apologize. And I came to the tail end of your presentation, Marty, so I've missed out a whole chunk of context. So the questions and thoughts that I have, you may have already addressed and answered, so I do apologize. But also, I don't know who you are, but what I could tell from what you presented and the energy, clearly very passionate about this area and you're in the space. So yeah, thank you for volunteering your time to present at the Guild. I guess there's a few things, and I guess I have drawn a picture on the whiteboard, but I was asking myself, what's your key, what's the key message that you've delivered today based on the experience that you had? Is your key insight that LLMs are today not ready nor appropriate to interpret law to give an accurate and good experience to the end consumer who's interfacing with it, which is this attempt that I had here on the diagram, right? Where it's like scenario one is take written law. There's an LLM that attempts to interpret that, and there's some sort of UI interface, be it ChatGPT's, chatbot or whatever, and then ask questions, bad experience, inaccurate, right? Versus is your key insight that, hey, LLMs are useful for helping seed a human validated source of truth, of which then we provide an interface to. Is that really is that the key message or your key insight, or am I missing something?
I think I'd say both of those points are correct, but I would add a couple caveats to the first one. So I would say for the first one, there like rules vary in degrees of complexity.
Yeah.
And in certain types of context, well, I think generally speaking, we should be wary of any type of unvalidated version of a rule.
Of course, non-human validated, of course.
Exactly. Yeah. And when we use large language models, in a sense, what we're doing is we're creating,
exposing ourselves to that risk of hallucination, et cetera, et cetera. Yep.
Exactly. So when we are doing that type of activity, I would say we should be extremely wary of the outcomes.
Yep.
And like that's just general. Like I don't think it's necessarily good or bad. I just think we should all be very wary of how we do it, the limitations of that process, and know the flaws of LLMs and generative AI in this kind of context. And then I'm arguing for the supplementation of rules as code within the LLM context as a way to. There's a couple things. One, as an interface to bring human validation into the process, having something that can be written in an encoded format that is legible for someone who is a subject matter expert without necessarily, subject matter expert, drafter, lawyer, expert in that sense, who isn't necessarily a programmer, so that they can intervene and make corrections where it's required. But LLMs could then still be used, like you can use it to say draft your first version of rules. Then you can have that version in a user-friendly rules as code style format that the humans go in and intervene with. And then if you want to simplify it further, then you could use LLMs again, or you could use NLPs. You can use technical tools to reduce it.
Sure.
Let me know if you want me to reframe that, because again, I just...
No, that's okay. I get it. And the other key insight is, which is what Blocks is thriving at, is just having a great tool that makes it easier for the law drafter themselves to use to begin with, rather than take it in a written form, have it in this digital form. I mean, that's from the source, rather than what we're doing is, because we're coming after the fact, this is a transitional period we're in, where we're trying to translate written law because that's all we have as a reference. But at some point in the future, it's the whole better rules thing, I guess, Joe, that we've talked about, right? Where we get it right in its digital purest form to begin with, which is a sort of crawl, walk, run strategy here, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah, we're at different starting points essentially. We're at different points of the process, and the way I do it is, how do I build something that, let's say, a drafter, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a drafter. We don't know who it could be. It could be the subject matter experts that propose a rule, for example. But how do you build that initial tool that gives the experts who understand the contents best and the way to formulate it in the law best, the way a means to digitize that rule at a high degree of fidelity from the start?
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
I would also say analogous to, say, like how Excel makes digital spreadsheets kind of fairly user-friendly for accountants or anyone in the finance space. You go further back, digital spreadsheets were not exactly user-friendly. It was mainly for programmers. So it's, how do we make this type of, and it doesn't have to be blocks, it could be anything. How do we make these kinds of tools that these rule makers want to use. They don't feel like they have to use it. It's not like a requirement. It's like, I actually want to use this. And there's a positive byproduct for them, as well as a positive byproduct for everyone who has to follow the rules.
Yeah. And sorry, this question, whether you did represent this and I missed it, but is this experimentation that you guys have done in this working group, is it you guys are looking or have created your own LLM to interpret law to convert it into the CUSP? The underlying language, I don't know, I can't remember the name of it now, but is that what you guys are trying to do to accelerate that, interpretation of law?
I haven't personally been building any LLMs of any sorts right now. I've just been experimenting with the usage of them through different tools. I use ChatGPT generally because that's a well-known one.
Sure.
But I do have colleagues that do play around with building different types of LLMs, and I know that this is happening in many places, and you could fine-tune some to make these kind of explanations like more sophisticated. There's ways to work in the LLM space to make up for the things that we could not see in my examples today.
Sure. Yeah. Natural. Yeah, no doubt. Cool. Awesome. Thank you, Marty.
I've remembered my question. My question is a very practical one, because obviously one of the barriers at the moment to rules as code is the time it takes. So just in terms of, how long it takes to go through the legislation, to do the logic, to then put it into code and open Fisker, etc. So I'm actually wondering, and I don't know whether you have this answer at the top of your head, but how long did it take you to do this particular piece of legislation in blocks?
So the one I showed today, I've gone through numerous iterations, simply because I've been taking it as my go-to example for people. And I just wanted to keep going in the weeds and just see what more stuff do I learn as I go. So I think this is version probably 14 of me trying different things. I don't think it has to go that far all the time, right? I'm doing this for the most part, just me and a small experimentation team. This isn't a giant effort with subject matter experts. I have a drafter that has been helping me a bit, right? But it's for the most part someone who's been doing it as a demo to write about it and express it and show some lessons and present things around it. I've done other encodings. So we've written, as I mentioned with the OECD paper, we've written a set of proposed regulatory text into code using blocks and connected it with an interpretation of the existing Act language and then ran simulations. We've done a couple iterations of that one, I think 4 or 5 now. I've written some stuff fairly quickly where it'd take me a few minutes to do. I've written stuff where it's taken me forever because there's a bug and I just cannot solve it. It's difficult to gauge exactly how long it takes to write rule with the buggy component of the software, because sometimes it's just like I'm trying to figure out a tiny missing thing. That's not me, it's actually the software that I'm currently using. But overall, I would say that having switched to blocks, at least not me personally, but the school and the person prior to me using other tools with other drafters, switching to blocks, we saw a massive increase in speed. Mainly, I think, because you have a lawyer and a programmer who can do both, which helps right off the bat. But I think also in the way that we generate these explanations, people can read them faster, we can identify things faster, we can go through and fix them and move on. So sorry if I can't gauge specifically how long it takes. I think it depends on the nature of the rule you're writing. And again, are we reaching kind of like, are we starting to stretch the capacity? Are we starting to do bigger pieces of encodings or bigger pieces of legislation? Are we using a new function that I'm not familiar with? That kind of stuff.
Thanks.
Awesome. We're at, what are we at? We're almost at 10 minutes to the hour. So we've taken up a lot of your time. I still have a pile of questions for you, if you're happy to stick around just a bit longer. Otherwise, maybe we can join you in the chat in the Slack channel, which everybody can join as well. And I know that Josh, who was here earlier, is going to have some questions, and you're going to find them in the Slack channel at some point.
I'm good to the top of the hour. So I'm good to go to the top of the hour. Yeah.
I appreciate it. Can I slot another one in, Com, before you?
Yeah, absolutely. You go with this. Yep.
Cool, awesome. So I'm interested in the other use case. I know your focus has been on blocks, right? But with LLMs, it's all about the data that they consume, right? Like the basis of the ChatGPT is scraping the internet, right? So are there any experiments that you know of in the Canadian government or elsewhere? Like I think of firms like LexisNexis, right, that have just the canon, right, of all of it, all of the law, right? So when an LLM is going to be trained on that, right, it can consume all of that. Surely it's going to be more accurate.
Yeah, so definitely as you train to specific contents, your LLM will be more accurate. There's no question about that. And obviously, as LLMs start to improve and continue to improve, as I'm sure they will, even if we meet, like a plateau and stuff, generally improvement will probably continue for a few more years, of course. Your answers are going to get better. You're not going to have as many errors like what I showed you today, right? That's for sure. But if you get to the crux of the matter, the core of what's happening here, LLMs are predicting and they're not reasoning. And I think that's the key difference. There's the area of generative AI, and rules as code would fall in the area of symbolic AI. So I would argue that we should be improving and working in both spaces and taking a neurosymbolic AI approach where we combine the best of both worlds together in the generation of tools. But yeah, I do know that generally speaking, I know there are various LLM Gen AI projects that are happening in government in different spaces for different things, but I'm not privy to the details of every single one of them. I generally am just noticing from the outside, and there's some experimentation internally with our team with building low-level tools, playing around with the different tools, just comparing them, but nothing more than that at the moment.
So thank you. I appreciate that. So my next question was kind of building on that. I just wanted to make sure my assumption was correct to start with, which is from a government perspective, right? There is a governance issue here, right? Which there always is, right? Around interpretation, around the ambiguities, about the correctness of the interpretation. So as well as you're an experimental part of the Canadian government and you're working on this project at the moment, but has there been thoughts about how you do govern a piece of technology and the group of people that are putting it together and putting it to use and making it available to the public potentially? And public could be lawyers, not just, not necessarily the general public, but to the public. Has there been any discussion around that governance piece at the moment?
So with my colleagues from the Rules as Code subcommittee and the AI Rules as Code work group at Justice, we talk about these types of questions. Again, just high-level experimental for the time being. But I would say like some of the key ones to consider if you're going to publish a rule in an encoded format, or if a government's going to encode a set of rules and publish it, there's definitely going to have to be consideration about the implications and liabilities and the warranty of the code and stuff like that. I think that, and I say I think because we haven't totally validated it yet, but I think that if you combine a open source license, let's say like an MIT license, where you cover for warranty and liability, and then you can also put a clear disclaimer that this is not official advice or government advice of any sort. And if you put some clear indication that large language model summaries of encodings are not the same, are not trusted interpretations, but simplifications of the code, and it's to be used at your own risk. I think if we put a fair bit of these warnings and disclaimers with an encoded piece of legislation, and then we clarify that encoded legislation is not equal to law itself, which is a big thing I need to be very clear about as well with people. In Canada, we have French and English are two official languages, and we have laws written in both languages. Those are the official languages. I don't think you legally can consider anything else as an official language, nor should you. An encoded version of a rule is a trustworthy interpretation of a rule for the sake of its practical use for people trying to interpret rules, but it is not the same thing as an official rule. So I would combine all that information together in a nice big disclaimer. I think there are ways to approach those types of issues. Again, we'd want to go and look into the details before anything is made at that level.
Thank you. That's awesome. Com.
Yeah, mine's a very different type of question to what we've had so far. Mine's more, there aren't, obviously this space is focused around government legislation, guidelines, eligibility, all those sorts of things can be applied for a bunch of different government related use cases. Governments from what the little bit I've seen, don't seem to be very open to funding rules as code experimentation. And it seems unusual, I suppose, that you've managed, or the Canadian government has managed to prioritize this and to fund your time, I believe, and your team's time. Under what sort of scheme is it? Is it under what's sort of the policy, or what's the scheme that is funding the efforts that you and your team are putting into this? Is it sort of like digital innovation in government, or is it something different?
So my position is with I think, but you feel free to like add and question further if my answer doesn't fully fill it up. My position is within the public sector innovation group, and specifically in an experimentation team. So we didn't actually say like we're going to do rules as code specifically, but rather there was requests from other departments like, oh, I hear about rules as code. Can we do some experiments with it? Over time, the experiments were moving successfully, and it kind of turned into its own file because the demand grew for that type of project. But it wasn't originally created as like, we're going to invest specifically in rules as code. It was very much kind of a natural formulation over a series of successful experiments in that space. But I have colleagues that do completely different types of experiments and innovation style work. Someone playing around, someone playing around with mixed reality right now, for example, seeing if you can have useful training tools in that space, for example. There are people working on the learning side, curriculum development. There's all sorts of types of experiments that happen, and as I said earlier, Gen AI as well. But it was not a focused effort originally. It was just a byproduct of some success with.
Oh, we just lost you there very briefly.
Oh.
Yep.
I forget what my last statement was, but my quick summary was that it was not a focused effort, but rather a byproduct of successful experimentation that happened to fall in that category over time.
Yeah. And so just one follow-up question quickly for that is, and again, this is technical, which department, if you like, which part of government does this fall under?
So I am located in a academic style institution within government called Canada School of Public Service. And within that group is the public sector innovation team. Part of my work fitting in the academic side is given a lot of the kind of experimental academic nature of it, but also there's a teaching and learning component to writing rules in an encoded format, especially if you're not from a programming background.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Hey, Jason, we're really, really close to the top of the hour. My last question is you can make it yes or no. There are other people that are writing rules, right? I'm very engaged in a community that is writing smart contracts, right, on a regular basis. Lots of them, normal people. A lot of them at the moment are still, developers, so they're more on the dev side than the law side, right? And they are coding up contracts for all kinds of things right now that actually, can include lots of real life stuff too, right? I wonder whether it's possible to take this out into the wild, into that area, rather than just in government, and look at some other use cases for this. Is that something you'd even consider?
Well, rules are not necessarily governmental rules, right?
No.
You could, if you asked Jason Morris, he would say that I think he had mentioned to me once he would love to write Dungeons and Dragons into code one day. So,
yeah.
Board games. You could do board games, contracts. I'm sure maybe the UI would be different. Maybe some components would be different. But rules are not exclusive to government. And there's also multiple levels of government. There's codes of conducts that you can write. There's standard bodies that can write rules. There's policies that you can write just as a private institution. It doesn't necessarily have to be a government endeavor. But I do think governments at the end of the day are the ones who write the biggest levels of rules, and there's probably a bigger bang for your buck at that level. So my push as of recently has been just, do the experimentation where I think it could have the most impact and see if it gets picked up anywhere. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be used anywhere else. I think any kind of rule space, there could be value.
Awesome. Thank you very much indeed. It's been wonderful. We haven't got to our second question, but hey, we've talked about a lot of other stuff, and actually about some of the challenges and obstacles to writing rules as code has been part of this conversation. Thank you so much for letting us into your work and your world and that particular act, which is fascinating that you picked that one. I have a whole load of questions about why you picked that one, but we'll do that in the Slack channel. Thank you for your time today, Marty. It's been wonderful, and we look forward to seeing you and everybody else on the next call, which will be the first Wednesday in, where are we, October, the first Wednesday in October. We'll see you all there, if not on the YouTube channel in between times. Again, thank you, Marty.
That's good. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Marty. Thanks, everyone. Bye.